Hey everybody, welcome back to the Yellow Box Podcast Season 3. Kevin, we're still here. We're rolling.
Still making it happen, bro. Still making it happen.
This is actually going to be the last episode of the season. We're going to wrap it here. Not rabbit here. We're going to wrap it here. And
I'd love to figure out what rabbit here looks like. Is that like run around aimlessly in a field? I mean, hey,
rabbit trail. We're going to rabbit trail here.
We're probably going to do that.
Yeah, man, we've covered some great topics, some timely topics. I think this season has really been marred by us, or marked, I guess, by innovation, because this is really the first season that we as a creative group have talked a lot about church world and church creative post-COVID and post, people kind of reopening and regathering and all of those things. And so today we're going to finish the season by talking a little bit about momentum, but really the idea is, man, now that we're up and running again and everything's kind of rolling, do we have the staying power that we need? And so we're titling this podcast, this particular episode, Are We Brightly Burning or Are We Burning Out? So let's talk about it.
Yeah, I think there's a big distinction there. I mean, we've seen a lot of things burn out in this season. Over the past several years, we've seen things that we thought would never have ceased to exist or operate the way they were, or with the momentum they had. We've seen them stop and cease and transition. And we've seen, in that same period of time, we've seen organizations that we knew and businesses that we knew start and stop in that window. And so we've seen churches start and stop. We've seen teams start and stop. And we've seen people's careers start and stop and take a different shift, a different direction. Yeah. And so, there's a lot to say. I think we are coming out of a generation, a season of life where, everybody 5 years ago, hype meant everything, right? Like hype was it. Like if you weren't hype, you weren't it. You didn't exist. The amount of followers you had meant everything. The amount of influence you had on social media meant everything. And we somehow generated this mindset that is what ties into actual success, to actually making it. And I really, just learned watching people who have staying power, watching people who have lasted through multiple storms, multiple organizations. Like if you think about it, if you ever meet a church or an organization that is over 100 years old as an entity, you should start asking questions. Because think about it. They've gone through, at this point, 2 global pandemics.
Right.
Through multiple, financial crises, through multiple wars, through multiple civil crises. They've gone through some crazy stuff to get and exist still where they are. And I don't think we think about that often. Like we're so enticed by the moment that we're not thinking through the long play here. And so there was this movie that I watched years ago. It's a story about a World War II soldier who was also a Olympic gold medalist, track and field star, and the whole kind of key line of it, like he gets captured by the Japanese during World War II and is in a prison camp, and obviously is not being treated very well, is being abused, is comes face to face with death multiple times, and so much loss that he saw. And when he was training to be a track star, his brother told him, you have to learn endurance. You have to learn how to push through. And he said, if you have to remember this, if you can take it, you can make it. And so I think we're really good at making things. We're really good at making like we have it all together. We're really good at faking it as people in this digital world we live in. Yeah. But we don't have the endurance sometimes, because I feel like we actually can't take it. We actually can't outlast the storm that's coming at us. We talked about this before. Are we digging deep? Last episode we did. Are we digging deep before we launch big? Are we are we digging deep as organizations to last the inevitable storms that come? Or are we doing that as people, as individuals, as creatives? And so that really goes into the conversation we're talking about today is, are you, brightly burning or burning out? And that has to do with, our kind of attention span as humans in 2022 is really built for burnout, because we're short attention span. This thing happens here. It's a big trend. Everybody's upset. Next week, everybody's on to something else. And so how are we as people preparing ourselves to dig in and make sure that we can last the inevitable storms of life individually, spiritually, physically, globally, that are going to hit? How are we prepared?
Yeah, it's so good. I think this season has brought a lot of thought around the idea of groundedness, and this other episode that you just referenced, the digging deep and your roots. We all want fruit in our ministry, and I think what we've noticed over the last few years is that we move from a place of valuing our following over valuing our fruit, and fruit sometimes looks different, but we're valuing our following, the likes, the engagement, the conferences, the things that we've been able to do over even just internal fruit and the fruit of our ministry and the longevity that comes with that. And there's just so much value to me in longevity and thinking through, how can I, yes, I want to burn brightly, but I want to do it for a long time. I don't want to burn brightly for a short season. I want to burn brightly over the long haul. And one of the things that I'm super passionate about is worship and worship leaders. And I think I read somewhere recently that the average worship leader tenure is less than 2 years. And it really stirred me to think, man, why is that? Because worship leaders can be celebrated, and creatives in general can be celebrated for what they produce and what they do. And so at any given moment, even in the creative church world, if you're in the world, you may know some people or some churches that are brightly burning, some churches that are nailing creative, they're nailing social media. There's design work out there, or designers or contractors who, like, you just say their first name and you're like, yeah, I know who that is. And we're not going to name them by name, but that's just the nature of what we do. Is you're known by what you're producing and you're following more so than your fruit. But Jesus said, you'll know they're my disciples by my love. And so coming all the way back around to this idea of staying power and staying rooted in love, like Paul talks about, is so important to our creativity. There's a direct link in my mind between the rootedness of identity and the rootedness of, man, I want to do this for a really long time. I'm not in it for a following, because following, crowds come and crowds go. But talk to me as somebody who's got some gray in your beard and some experience to share about what would you say are the ingredients that have kept you and given you longevity through the years that you've spent in ministry, in all of your travels?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, friends come and go, partners come and go, people who you work with come and go, partners, meaning, business partners, organizational partners, operational partners. Hopefully your marriage doesn't have that. That hasn't been my case. I've been with Natalie since I was in 7th grade. So I don't know what it means to live like that as an adult, trying to find someone. So God bless you if you're trying to find a significant other in today's day and age. God bless you. It's got to be incredibly stressful. But I mean that in the sense of people who come alongside you or the organization you work with, they come and go. That also means that, and this one might hit too close to home for some people, dreams come and go. What you dreamt about doing 5 years ago, 10 years ago may shift and may change. What does that truly look like? What does that truly look like as an individual? What does that truly look like as an organization? Sometimes that means realigning, and sometimes it's really scary when that realignment's happening and you've built something on one model, like let's say you planted a church and your dream starts to change, your dream starts to shift. That doesn't mean shut everything down. That means, what am I doing to build this thing beyond just the initial phase, the initial dream? What happens when the dream that I had doesn't make it? Does that mean I shut everything down? I think for me personally, this past season was really difficult, losing friends, losing people who'd been a part of the organization, losing partners, losing, that whole system of support and encouragement and assurance. Like, you have to figure out where you place it on. And I think that for me, I kept having that conversation with God. Like, should I just pack up the tent and go home? Like, is this, because we look for something to fulfill the way that it always fulfills. And when it doesn't fulfill that way anymore, our flesh says it's time to pack up. But if you have staying power, if you're willing to stay, this is the last thing I knew I heard. This is the last thing I know God spoke to me. This is the last thing I knew I felt compelled to do. I'm going all in here. So at that point, it doesn't matter what the feelings say. At that point, it doesn't matter what the ebb and flow of the inevitable emotional change that's going to come and go. It doesn't matter what that says. What did you hear last? Like, what did you know last?
So good.
What is that thing that you can really put a stake in the ground on and go, this is where I'm going to keep pointing back to this. And that's where I'm pointing back to that statement I said earlier. If you can take it, you can make it. Like, if I can take this storm and not just say, that's it. I've had enough. I've had people come at me, or I've had friends say they can't be friends with me anymore because I said something they disagreed with on social media about politics, like whatever the case is. I mean, this is true story, real life here. I feel like that stuff can shake you. It really can shake you to your core. But if your core isn't built on you, it's not me. Like, I can't, if we're building Yellow Box together, it can't be me. It has to be us together. And so I got to lean on other people at that point.
Yeah.
When I'm feeling down, when I don't know what's going on, like, I got to lean on you. I got to lean on MJ. I got to lean on Tristan. I got to lean on, Pepe. I got to lean on anybody who calls themselves a part of the organization that we love. Like, I'm going to lean on those people and trust them, because sometimes I don't have it all together.
Yeah.
Most of the time, I don't have it. I don't even have a head of hair, bro. I'm not going to pretend I got this all together. Look at you. You got this nice, like, swoop going on.
It's working. It's working today. No, I think that's so good, man. I think when the winds blow, when the winds come and the rains come, you have to go back to what got you in, like why you started again. And I'll never forget when my wife and I had our 10-year wedding anniversary. We sat down and we sat down on the back porch. We were in the mountains in Colorado, and we just wrote down just some vision, just some like fresh vision for where we were and where we wanted to be, what we wanted out of church, out of ministry, out of life. And it was really a moment for us where we're like, man, let's write this down and just dream for our future. Let's dream for our family. And that list of things, just keeping that in front of us. I even mentioned it to her like about a month ago. I said, hey, we need to go find that and pull that back out and look at it, because we've been through some storms. And in the midst of it, I think it's so important to remind yourself of why you're doing what you're doing. In fact, I think something that's kept me in ministry as long as it has is reminding myself and asking myself, why am I doing this again? Like about every 6 months, Kevin, I think I ask myself that, and I have to remind myself, not that I'm looking to leave, but like when the storms come and when things get hard, if you don't have a clear understanding of your why, that's going to be the thing where it's easy to just, like you said, pack up your tent, take your ball and go home or whatever that looks like. Okay, so I think that's a great setup, and we're talking a lot about ethereal things in the season that we're in. I want to talk about, as we turn this kind of the part 2 of this particular episode, to talk a little bit about staying power in your church and staying power in your communication, because a lot of church models have changed. But Sunday still comes. So we're still doing Sunday services. That's still a thing. And social media is still a thing, and websites are still a thing. A lot of churches are doing capital campaigns now. And you've got your kind of a new flow, maybe not as event driven, maybe more community driven. But let's talk a little bit about how, like, church staff models and then communication models, because church staff models is one thing. So the question is our church staff model, or is our creative team model built for the long game? Is there sustainability in that? And so let's answer that question first, and then we'll go from there. So what have you noticed amongst churches, creative teams post COVID?
Well, I mean, I think if anybody comes to the table and says, this is it, this is the model, this is working, everybody adopt this. I mean, I think that you have to take things into account. Like, this is working for someone. This is working in their scenario where they are at, location-wise, culture-wise, all this. There's a bunch of variables to what works and doesn't work. And so I think, you know, you really do have to do the hard work of getting to know and read and understand and ask and poll the people in your organization, like, know what people are feeling. You know, like, if you're oblivious to the fact that everybody's stressed out all the time and this isn't sustainable, then you're going to be, you know, unable to change the course that you're on. You know, you're going to stay in that lane, and people are going to get burned out, and they're going to leave, and you're going to blame it on something else, everything else but you or your culture or whatever the, like, common denominator is. At some point you have to look in the mirror and go, man, maybe we could have changed this. Maybe we could have done that. Maybe we could. I mean, I still do that now when I think about the situations that came and go. I'm like, man, did I do something that I shouldn't? Could I change something? If that was to happen today, what would I do different? Right. I think that that's a good, healthy question to ask when you're looking at the long game, is evaluating all of the information you can. And so getting to know the struggle points, the pain points for people on your team, I think is a really good thing to ask. Really, it might hurt, you know, it might be pride like killing, which is honestly probably a good thing. But like, I think it does, there's some truth in that hurts a little bit. You know, what can I do? Like, I've focused on all the wrong things. I think models built for the long game do healthy evaluations on how is it really working? Like, we can't live in the storm all the time.
Yeah.
So on that point, like, I think it goes to some of that to process too, right? Like, what is your
totally.
And we talked about that. There's a good episode we have called Break the Glass. Seems like that's always it's the case for countless creative teams across the nation and churches.
Yeah.
We live by breaking the glass mode, you know, but if you go and break the glass all the time, someone's gonna cut their foot.
Yeah, for sure. When I think about staying power and longevity, I can't help but think generationally. I can't help but think about the divide that we're seeing in the church between kind of the boomers and then us and then the Gen Zers and then what comes after that, the alphas. So everybody's living in a different space. So the boomers
completely eliminated the Generation X.
Yeah, I mean, I just said us. Like,
we're Xennials because we're right there in the middle of those two.
We're in the middle.
Yeah, we're Xennials, but they're all. But here's still Generation X running things, you know.
Because our society's become so much more isolated. Where you were before COVID, like where you lived, like you're further down the rabbit trail. So here we go back to rabbits. So the boomers are almost like exclusively on Facebook, whereas like the alphas and the who comes before alphas, the Zers, they're like on TikTok. And what's interesting is we have to think more and beyond, right? So we have to think more about some of these other avenues of where do we need to be? What spaces do we need to live in? Because we're still like everybody's getting older, right? And so one of the things that we learned as an organization, and we're just learning, is like we're starting to post on TikTok more. Why? Because that's where a lot of the younger people younger creatives are spending a lot more of their time and not as subject to the algorithm. So TikTok and YouTube are not. However, Facebook and Instagram obviously are. You can't just leave those platforms. You need to be living there. But talk a little bit about that, the age divide and where people are getting connected and staying and living.
Yeah, I mean, it also goes to not just platforms that you live in and breathe on or exist in or create content for. It also has to do with, how you look at developing culture and how you look at developing your processes. So if you think about it, like I was talking with, so I have
Sorry.
Nick's over there getting broken into. His house is getting broken into.
No, sorry. I know there's a lot of noise. My daughter came in twice already, so this is real life. We're living the dad life over here.
No, like that. I mean, that's what I texted Sophie. I was like, "Hey, I'm recording a podcast." She's about to get home from school. And
my daughter just came up from school.
Well, that's the thing is like, it's taught me a little bit about, like, I remember 8th grade for me. So my middle schooler, my middle child is in 8th grade right now. Public school, it's, walking distance from our house. Like literally, like I could probably throw a tennis ball out back really hard. Well, maybe I can't throw a tennis ball that hard. I could hit it with a tennis racket pretty hard and hit the school. Yeah. Actually, it's like that close. Like we could hear the announcements and stuff. And so it's interesting to me because like middle school kids are just as mean as they were when I was in school, but the things that are accepted are not the same. The things that are acceptable, right? So, I mean, I remember, dude, I got beat up in junior high a lot. Physically. Yeah. Not just made fun of, but physically beat up. And I mean, cause I still am nerdy, geeky. I like sci-fi. I have an X-Files poster behind me on the wall. There's a Baby Yoda tiki cup behind me. Like I am okay with people knowing that I'm a geek. I don't care. Like I'm not going to hide it. But that wasn't really a popular thing when I was growing up. I mean, and so I was a skinny kid. And I had a bigger mouth than I did the ability to take on someone, right? Bigger mouth than I had any like arms or the ability to outrun somebody. So I got myself in a lot of trouble. I mean, but the thing is there was never any repercussions to it. Like it would just move on. And so today what I'm learning that like this generation's, basically what they're willing to put up with, what they're willing to deal with in a hard scenario, how they're willing to be treated. There's a line for how they're willing to be treated. There's a level of respect that they come to the table expecting, not because they're spoiled, but because they've grown up in a world that is kinder in nature than ours was. Now, it might not seem that way politically or in some of these facets, but if you think about who's leading those charges with arguments and who's leading those charges with violence and with, like all the hate, it's not the younger generation as much. It's us, our generation, basically, and boomers, like, and Xers, like we're the louder voices leading those things. It's not the next generations coming in. They have a certain level of tolerance that they're not willing to put up with, and they will call it out, and they will call it out loudly. And they have all the platforms in the world to call it out loudly on. Like you could not get away with anything, which I know it sounds like, oh, everybody's going to call it cancel culture or something like that. But like, dude, there were mistakes made when I was a kid that there was never justice for.
Yeah.
And so I didn't have the power to call it out. I didn't have the power to speak for myself. These kids aren't waiting for someone else to speak for them. They're going to speak for themselves, and they have a platform to do it. And some of them have millions of followers.
Yeah.
It's wild.
Well, what we forget is, because we grew up, what is it? Analog. And then we have a digital adulthood.
What's that thing called before things had digital computers? Before things, it was analog. Yeah.
Our children, they've only known digital world. So things live forever there. And I think the church needs to catch up to that and realize that like the stances and the things that we say and the sermons, it's almost like when you go on the Disney Plus channel and some of the old cartoons from like the 60s, 70s and 80s, and you watch them and you're like, this is so awful. This is racist. Like there's smoking and there's just like all this stuff that you're like, I can't believe like these were normal.
All the stereotypes. Yeah.
I'm like, I I wonder, I mean, again, culture has changed, but like we want to be, I think we need to rethink a lot of our strategy, our communication strategies and things like that. I'm not saying we need to change our theology. Hear my heart. I do think that communication needs to be thought through a little bit different, especially in how we communicate to the next generation. So talk to me a little bit as we kind of wrap this podcast about questions that we might be asking ourselves in regards to what do we need to be building? How do we need to be communicating? What kind of campaigns and consistency do we need to see? Obviously, there's algorithms that we're facing in certain platforms, but beyond that, man, just for us to have staying power and being healthy, what would you recommend to teams that are like, man, are we on a sustainable pace, or like, do we need to stop? And by the way, the answer is yes. We need to stop and really examine and say, hey, let's have a strategic conversation about our team, what our goals are. I mean, we're going into fall, which is a big season, but really the biggest season is Christmas to Easter. So when you're thinking about the next 12 months, you really need to be thinking about not just from here to Christmas, but from Christmas to Easter, because so we're looking at about an 8-month period. What are the things that need to be happening, taking into account families, taking into account holidays, taking into account whatever else it may or may not be happening, and then how do we need to be reaching out to our community, and then setting some realistic goals. So what would be some tips in terms of just setting some realistic goals for the team without burning them out?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing would be, you said the word strategic, right? I think strategy plays a huge role in determining if we're going to be brightly burning or we're going to be burning out. I think that using strategy to decide when to plan, sets of seasons and conversations as a church to inform your creative, I think all those things play into it. Yeah. I think that having a constant flurry of action, if your entire structure from creative to ministry to scheduling to volunteer teams to ministry programs is just a constant flurry of action, it may seem like everything's successful on the outside. And you can if you have enough resources, you can throw enough money to keep that going for a while. But if your turnover is much higher than your staying power in that scenario, from a team's perspective, from a staff perspective, from a volunteer perspective, that production is not sustainable. And you think about the quality over quantity, right? Like that's the thing that really does matter. Is what am I really going to plan here? What are we going to put all of our equipment in on, all of our passion in on? And when are we going to decide, okay, like this one we can kind of repurpose some stuff on. I think that those things play a huge factor in that. And the other aspect of that is the idea of burning out is something to really take an introspective look at on a regular basis. And each season, like we're looking right now at, you said the fall going into Christmas and then into Easter, right? Like this is something to think about, but I doubt that anybody listening or watching this podcast has figured out what they're going to do. I'd be very surprised for Easter of next year. Like very surprised. I'd be very impressed because most people haven't figured out what they want to do for Christmas yet. Yeah. And part of that is because of this constant flurry of action on a daily basis. So it feels like we're getting a lot done and it feels like we're making moves, but it's so much energy just to sustain where we're at that we're not going to be able to grow out to get where we need to go. So some of that might be staffing. Am I staffed correctly? It's a good question to ask. Priority. What matters most? What really matters most in this moment, in this season that we're in? And that goes back to what you talked about earlier about theology. Yeah, we're not asking you to change all that. We're asking you to consider that what matters most in this conversation is what matters most in this conversation to use my platform as a political stomping tool, or is it to talk about the kingdom? Is it to talk about Jesus? Is it to lift him high that others might be drawn unto him? That I think that should inform your creative. If you're trying to pull in political conversations all the time and you're seeing growth from it, I would question why that's working or why you think it's working. It might not be growth. It might just be migration. right? And so migration isn't something that you're taking away from here to put here. You're not really growing anything. And that also can happen with team members. You can also have team members migrate. I mean, how many people we known over the years that, oh, so-and-so, man, they're over there now.
Yeah.
Weren't they over here? I mean, so I feel like there's an element of that has to do with staffing. It has to do with strategy. It has to do with vision, and priority, what matters most.
Yep.
I think another question I would ask is, like, what is realistic to get done this year, this season, this month, next week? What's realistic?
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me about that. What is realistic? What does realism look like in a creative field?
So I think there's a lot that can be done, but for me, being realistic is I want to be able to do ministry and do it well, and have my volunteers and my staff and their families still love the church and love Jesus at the end of it all. Is that's a realistic goal for me. And that might instruct my pace. It might instruct my scope of what we want to do and how hard we want to push. I think you can't do all of it, but you also have to be really measured about, like, hey, how can we make impact? I'm not saying to reduce impact. Everybody loves to look. I'm going to use a physical example. We want to look fit. We want to look strong. We want to show off our muscles, suns out, guns out. We want to do that at all times because that's what gets celebrated. We want to take those pictures, put it on social media, and flex on people physically. That's what we want to do. Nobody wants to talk about their digestion. Nobody wants to talk about their bowels. Nobody wants to talk about how their digestion is. But what is realistic is, like, man, what if, like, you're having digestion issues and you don't even realize it, or you don't want to talk about it because your digestion is off. You have a leaky gut, or your gut's unhealthy. But on the outside, you look great. You're oiled up. You've got muscles. You're popping. And you've got all the filters, and it works great, and you look great, but your digestion is off. So all we're saying is that, like, for longevity's sake, you might need to not go to the gym for, like, however long, or alter what you're eating and putting in, just so that, even if it means that you might have a little bit of atrophy and not be as bulky as you were before, just so that you can ensure longevity. I'm fascinated by offensive linemen in football, how they'll gain weight and
talk to me. What's football again?
Oh my gosh, Kevin. Yeah. So I'm using sports analogies, creatives, and please take some time to watch that. But offensive linemen are the big guys who do most of the blocking in football. And usually when offensive linemen retire from the NFL, they'll go one of two ways. They'll either drop a ton of weight and get super fit and lean, or they'll just continue to be on the larger side. It's just fascinating to me to see, but they'll almost never stay the same. And it's just interesting to think through, okay, so what did they change? What needed to change? Like, what did they need to do to even be an offensive lineman? Anyways, that kind of stuff is fascinating to me. But I would say, let's apply that principle to your staff and your processes, and ask yourself, hey, what does need to change in this next year, and where does some digestion need to take place? One of the things that I found in my seasons of ministry is that I would be in seasons where we just got done with a big weekend, and literally the next thing was coming right back to back. And I'm not saying it's bad, right? Because when momentum hits, you got to be ready to roll and be on it. And we loved it. But when you move at a pace where there is digestion and you're allowed to stop, take time to celebrate and do these things, it's not just a flurry of action, but there's consistency to say, hey, we're actually going to take time to celebrate the fruit just as much as the following. The following is going to come, but let's celebrate the fruit as well. And so as we wrap, I just want to say, if you're listening to this podcast, Yellow Box, hopefully it's been something that's been a blessing to you, just to think outside of just the scope of your day to day, but also, like, we're here to help and answer any questions that you guys may have. As you think about your next 8 months or a year or whatever that looks like, you want to talk through some big rock projects, or you need some strategy on it. How do we get this done? Or how can we line up some of these dominoes to make sense for us And maybe we need to take a couple of the dominoes away. Maybe we need to add a couple here and there. It will vary depending on who you are, where you're at, and who your demographic is, or think through your communication. How are we communicating? When are we communicating? Who are we communicating to? Who is our audience? Who do we want to reach? All of those are questions that it's ever changing because communities are changing. How communities think about churches are changing depending on where you're at in the country. And so there's just a lot of change. And I think you're not going to maximize the effectiveness of your ministry unless you slow down enough to say, hey, is what we're doing the best we can do to impact our community for Jesus, to show God's love, to spread the gospel, to share the word, like to do all the things that God's called us to do. The message of Jesus is what we're doing, is the approach right?
Well, not just the best we can do, not the best so and so can do, not the best elevation, not the best life church, not the best that could be done, the best we can do right now. We're the ones called to do this. And if we're going to do it and actually stay doing it, what is the best we can do? Yeah.
I will say this too, just to add on to that. The best I can do is based upon my personal limitations.
Yeah.
And if you're listening, take a deep breath, because guess what? We all are finite resources serving an infinite God. So we're finite. We have limitations. There's only so much we can take. We have to understand and embrace our limitations. And that's the beginning of creativity, is understanding your limitations, understanding your constraints. And then out of that place, we can say, God, this is what we can do as a team, as a church, collectively, and we're going to trust you with the rest. It's where the natural meets the super, and then the supernatural begins to happen. And so that's our prayer for you. If you're listening to this, again, thank you, is that you would take the time to take a step back, have a strategic conversation, ask yourself the right questions, because our prayer is that you would be doing this for as long as the Lord tarries in your life, and that your ministry would not be cut short because of a burnout. But we pray that you would burn bright and long and shine Jesus's light as bright for as long as possible. We're here to help and give you encouragement in that journey.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for taking the time and watching and listening to this season of the Yellow Box podcast. We are going to be cutting the season here and picking back up next season with some new conversations, but so that you're not living without crazy, weird content from people under the Yellow Box umbrella, we actually have some new podcasts coming out. And the first one is called Leading Worship. And so, Nick, talk to me about that. It's actually dropping this month. So tell me a little bit about what's going on. What's the deal?
Yeah, leading worship. Leading worship is exactly what you probably think it is. It's myself and my good friend Andy Chrisman. We're going to be unpacking lots of different topics, but the heart behind it is to equip and encourage worship leaders and worship pastors to become better at leading worship, at leading teams and people, at thinking through principles and best practices, just to create an environment of health and holiness around themselves personally, and then in their team and in how they lead. And leading worship doesn't just happen on a platform. It happens off stage. It happens in your communication. It happens in how you lead your team. And we just want to have those conversations and hopefully help worship leaders to get better at what you do. Yes, so Leading Worship is going to be dropping very soon, if not out already, wherever podcasts are streaming. Take a listen, share with your team, share with your creative team and your worship leaders. And we hope it's a blessing to you. Again, thank you guys so much for listening and being a part of the Yellow Box podcast. We'll see you next season.